evergreen house stood on a secluded hill, surrounded by a dense forest that barely allowed sunlight to penetrate. Maher's family had moved there seeking peace and quiet, but they soon discovered that its ancient walls concealed a dark history and terrifying whispers from the past. From the first day, the youngest son, 7-year-old Yusef, felt a sense of dread towards the basement. It was a heavy wooden door located at the end of a dark hallway, and Yusef refused to go near it, claiming he heard sad whispers coming from behind it. Maher and his wife initially dismissed his fears, considering them mere childish fantasies. But it wasn't long before Layla, the 15-year-old older daughter, also began to feel something strange. She would hear faint scratching noises coming from a small ventilation opening in their living room wall, an opening that led directly to the basement. The sounds often occurred at night, as if something was moving or scraping against the walls in the darkness. One night, Maher woke up to a muffled scream coming from Yusef's room. He rushed to the room to find Yusef sitting up in his bed, trembling, his eyes wide with terror. Yusef said in a shaky voice, "I saw eyes glowing in the dark under my bed. Red eyes looking at me." Maher found nothing, but Yusef's fear was real. Layla began to suffer from terrifying nightmares. She would dream of a black shadow creeping out from under the basement door, growing and expanding until it covered the entire room, then reaching out long, thin arms towards her. She would wake up terrified, feeling a strange coldness enveloping her body. One day, Maher finally decided to inspect the basement. He took a powerful flashlight and descended the creaking wooden stairs that groaned under his weight. The smell downstairs was foul, a mixture of dampness, mildew, and old dust. There was a long, dark corridor leading to several small rooms. At the end of the corridor was the door that Yusef feared. Maher approached the door and felt an intense cold emanating from it. The door was made of dark oak wood and had no visible handle or hinges. It looked like an inseparable part of the stone wall. Maher placed his hand on its cold surface and felt something move lightly beneath it, like a faint pulse or a subtle vibration. Suddenly, Maher heard a weak whisper coming from behind the door. The voice was hoarse and muffled, as if it came from a distance, but it carried a tone of deep hunger and eternal despair. Maher tried to understand the words, but they were just sighs and painful groans. Maher recoiled in fear, feeling that there was something alive behind this door, something suffering and starving. He hurried back upstairs and didn't tell his wife or children what he had heard or felt. But he knew that something evil resided in the basement. In the following nights, the sounds became clearer and more disturbing. Layla would hear heavy footsteps moving slowly in the basement, as if something large was pacing back and forth. Yusef would cry at night, claiming that the red eyes were looking at him through the ventilation opening. One night, the electricity in the house suddenly went out. Everything was plunged into darkness. Maher lit some candles, but the flickering shadows made the atmosphere even more terrifying. While they were gathered in the living room, they heard a violent banging from the basement, as if something huge was trying to break down the door. Yusef trembled and hid behind his mother. Layla was pale-faced, her eyes fixed on the ventilation opening. Suddenly, a loud scratching sound began to come from the opening, as if sharp claws were trying to tear through the metal. Maher felt terror freeze in his veins. He grabbed an old axe that was hanging on the wall and headed towards the basement door. His wife followed him fearfully, carrying a trembling candle. When they reached the door, the banging had stopped, but they heard muffled whispers coming from behind it, whispers carrying an insatiable hunger and an evil desire to get out. Maher put his ear to the door and could make out hoarse words, "Hungry, hungry, want to eat." Maher froze in place. This was not a human voice. It was something else, something evil and hungry waiting in the dark. Suddenly, the door shook violently, as if something huge was pushing against it from the inside. The family recoiled in fear. The door began to crack and make terrifying breaking sounds. At that moment, they saw a thick black shadow seeping from under the door, spreading on the floor like a dark oil slick. The shadow began to take shape, forming a distorted creature with long, thin limbs and glowing red eyes that stared at them with relentless hunger. Yusef let out a muffled scream and hid behind his mother. Layla was trembling violently. Maher raised the axe, ready to defend his family, but he felt that they were facing something beyond their strength. The creature began to move slowly towards them, its hungry whispers filling the room. The smell emanating from it was foul, a mixture of decay and death. They felt despair engulf them, trapped in their home with this hungry shadow coming from the dark abyss beneath their feet. As the hungry shadow approached and the blood ran cold in Maher and Layla's veins, Yusef suddenly remembered an old tale his grandmother used to tell about the house. She said there was an ancient inscription carved on the front door's threshold, a charm to protect the house from any evil that might try to enter. "The front door! The charm on the door!" Yusef cried out in a trembling voice, pointing his small hand towards the entrance. Maher and Layla looked at each other for a moment, then turned and ran with all their might towards the front door, the shadow slowly creeping behind them, its hungry whispers chasing them in the darkness. When they reached the front door, they could barely see in the dim candlelight strange carvings etched into the old wooden threshold. They didn't understand the words, but they felt a faint aura emanating from them. The shadow was getting closer, having reached the middle of the hallway. It stretched out a thin arm towards them, its sharp claws glinting in the dark. With desperate courage, Maher, Layla and Yusef stood together on the threshold and placed their hands on it. Suddenly, they felt a strong pulse emanating from the old wood, and a faint light began to glow around the inscriptions. The shadow stopped abruptly, as if an invisible force was repelling it. It began to retreat slowly, its hungry whispers turning into a muffled groan, its glowing red eyes gradually dimmed. The glow of the inscriptions on the threshold intensified, and they felt a warmth spreading throughout the house. The shadow began to fade, crumbling like black smoke until it disappeared completely into the darkness. A deathly silence fell over the house, as if the nightmare had ended. Maher, Layla and Yusef stood on the threshold, feeling terrified and exhausted, but they were alive. In the morning, Maher carefully examined the threshold. The ancient carvings looked clearer and brighter. He felt that there was a real protective power inherent in this old house, a power that had been dormant until awakened by the danger. The family decided to stay in Evergreen House, but they never looked at it the same way again. They knew that there was an evil lurking in the forgotten basement, but they also knew that there was an ancient protection standing between them and the darkness. They continued to avoid the basement as much as possible, always keeping the door closed and tightly sealed. But on quiet nights, they would sometimes hear faint whispers coming from below, a constant reminder of the hungry shadow waiting in the dark and the ancient power that protected them on the threshold. And they lived in wary fear.